I don't think I've ever done the final lecture somewhere. It's a rather, yeah, it's rather like being on the stage and giving the last performance before a theatre goes dark forever. So yes, it's both an honour and slightly saddening perhaps. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be back in New Zealand. It's been an important country in my professional life. In the 1990s, news began to filter back to the UK of important events taking place, of attempts to transform early childhood education in New Zealand. I can remember very clearly attending a lecture in London by an excited recent visitor from Britain who sort of brought the good news from Aix to Ghent back to us. And we sat there thinking, gosh, this is really quite something. And ever since I've followed New Zealand closely, I've chaired the Times of Progress, and I've been saddened to hear of the retreats that have sometimes happened. And I most recently, as Marek said, had the privilege to work with Linda Mitchell, who I'm delighted is in the audience, on a new book in which New Zealand plays a leading role, and more of that later. But my New Zealand connection goes back further than the 1990s, in fact, to 1973, 50 years ago, when the Thomas Coram Research Unit at London's Institute of Education was founded by a remarkable New Zealand social researcher, Jack Tizard. Jack came to the UK after World War II and established a reputation for research that improved the lives of children and adults with learning disabilities, which is how I came to meet him, in fact. But when he got the opportunity to establish his own research unit at the Institute of Education in 1973, he decided to turn his attention to a new subject, early childhood services. He saw that early childhood in England was totally inadequate and dysfunctional. It was insufficient in quantity, it was fragmented, it was incoherent and unresponsive to the needs of children and parents, etc., etc. What was called for, he concluded, was a total transformation, a new type of service that would be integrated, community-based, available to all children and all families, multi-purpose and free. He called this new public provision the Children's Centre. And the first task of his newly founded research unit back in 1973 was to open and research 2 children's centres in London. These were demonstration projects that were to prove the viability of his concept. I joined TCRU on day one. I'm the only person still around who was there on day one. A very callow young researcher, and I knew nothing about early childhood, so obviously very well equipped to join the unit for whom that was to be a new priority. But I learned very quickly working on the Children's Centre projects. And this experience and working with Jack left an indelible impression on me, shaping my thinking to the present day. I can't imagine being where I am today without having that experience of being a junior researcher to Jack. Jack died prematurely in 1979, and his vision and research on children's centres were, of course, why should I say of course, they were neglected by successive English governments until 30 years later, when our new Labour government, Tony Blair, you may remember him, suddenly took up the concept, and within just 7 years, England opened 3,600 children's centres, which shows what you can do if you actually want to do it. You don't have to wait for the private sector to do it. However, that has been followed by 14 years of Conservative government, which have totally neglected this legacy and letting these children's centres wither away. Jack would have been saddened by such a waste, and equally saddened to see early childhood in England today dominated by a marketised system of mainly for-profit private nurseries. It's a negation, I think, of everything that this great New Zealander stood for. You can read more about Jack and the children's centres that he championed in a new book published, which is, I think Marek just touched on, to mark 50 years of Thomas Coram Research Unit, and it's full of other contributions on research done at the unit and indeed research methods developed at the unit by researchers past and present. And please note, it is freely available online due to the enlightened publishing policy of our publisher, UCL Press. I have flyers, so please feel free afterwards to take them away, but just put in the title and UCL Press, and up it will come, and you can read whatever you want to read. There'll be more to come. I started this introduction back in the 1990s, and the good news arriving then in the UK from New Zealand. And the 1990s was also the decade of another important new influence in my professional life, a collaboration with my dear friend Gunilla Dahlberg from Sweden and my good friend Alan Pence from Canada, that led to us writing this book, published almost 25 years ago. The book has since gone into 3 English editions. It's been translated at least into 12 languages, and last time I looked, for those who like this sort of thing, it had been cited over 2,500 times. So at one level, a great success, but on another level, also a failure, for reasons I will come back to. For those of you who've not read it recently, Beyond Quality's themes include the importance of paradigm. We looked at 2 paradigms, modernity and postmodernity, and of course there are other paradigms, or you can reconceptualize these terms. Another theme was the importance of social construction and images. We had chapters on the images of early childhood and images of the early childhood institution. A third theme was the pedagogical work of Reggio Emilia, including an excellent chapter, which I can say it was excellent since I didn't write it. It was Gunilla's draft, and on pedagogical documentation. A fourth theme is evaluation. The original book in English, the subtitle was Postmodern Perspectives. When it was translated into Italian by Reggio Children, they took it on themselves to change the subtitle to Languages of Evaluation. And we didn't get piqued by that, thought it was rather good. And in subsequent English editions, that is the subtitle it has got. And perhaps the most important theme of all is the problem with quality. And this was a problem that had been becoming increasingly apparent since the 1980s. And we summarized it like this. This is how we summarized the problem with quality. Could the concept and practice of quality welcome and include context and values, subjectivity and multiple perspectives, complexity and uncertainty, participation and argumentation? And if it could, how could it do this? We went on, without convincing answers to these questions, quality seemed to lead down a dangerous road, contributing to 2 disturbing processes: the increasing standardization and regulation of modern life, and the substitution of democratic politics by managerial practice. So we were flagging up that we were troubled, like others were, with this problem with quality and its apparent inability to cope with what we thought were rather important issues like context and so forth. Now, one solution that people were putting forward to this problem with quality was basically to rethink, reconceptualize quality. Proponents of this approach argued that quality could be conceptualized and it could be treated as subjective, value-based, relative and dynamic. It could cope with the possibility of multiple perspectives, of lots of different people having different views on things. In this approach, quality could be contextualized spatially and temporally, recognising cultural and other forms of diversity. And quality could be defined by an inclusive process with a wide range of stakeholders involved in the definition process. But to Gunilla, Alan and myself, this solution, this attempt to make quality fit a different way of thinking, didn't seem to us convincing, because it seemed to us to lead to a chaos of many qualities. Before you would know it, you would end up with English quality, New Zealand quality, Chinese quality, Japanese quality, and so on and so forth, as indeed in comparative ethnography we actually find happens. You'd end up, in short, with multiple definitions, and you would be left asking, whose quality are we talking about? How and why has it been defined? And is there any way that quality could be comparable if we didn't know whose quality it was we were talking about? So, what our book did, and why it was beyond quality, was that it concluded that quality is not a neutral term, not a neutral word. Quality, the concept, is inscribed with particular values and assumptions. For example, the value of universality, of objectivity, of stability and certainty and closure. In other words, quality has these values, and it simply can't welcome, it can't value context and diversity and subjectivity and multiplicity. Because actually, quality hasn't dropped out of the sky. It's a socially constructed concept with a very particular meaning. And the very particular meaning quality has is conformity to expert-derived norms that are presumed to be universal, objective, and stable. We argued that you go back to the post-war years when the Japanese car industry was picking itself up. And one of its strengths was its claim of having high-quality cars. And that was because the cars did conform to universal, objective, and stable criteria for cars. So when you bought a Japanese car, you could be quite certain that that's what you were getting. You were getting a quality car. But really, it raises the question of whether building a car and doing education is the same thing, which we'll come back to in a moment. Put another way, quality is just one language of evaluation. Remember that subtitle that in Reggio Emilia they gave us. So you can think of quality as one way of talking about, thinking about a language of evaluation. It's a language of rating scales, checklists, standardized protocols and procedures, detailed systems of inspection, etc. It's a measurement of performance as conformity to norm. And often quality is expressed as a number or a category. This centre is a 36, or it is good or needs improvement or whatever. And we wrote in the book, quality as such is a powerful tool for normalization and control, for governing at a distance and managing performance. So really for us, the problem with quality could only be solved by getting beyond quality. And to recap, we said that because the concept and language of quality cannot welcome and include diversity and multiple perspectives, contextual specificity and subjectivity. It's like if you have a quality car, you don't want to think that it's been subject to multiple perspectives and subjectivity. You want to believe that it's been the result of universal norms objectively applied to make sure the car works properly and is safe. If you want to work with diversity, etc., you need to go beyond the concept of quality. Now, we didn't argue for dumping quality, but we did think, or rather we thought that people should stop and think before they use the term. So as I say, we didn't say you mustn't use it, we just said think. We wrote, central to the book is a simple idea. Quality is a choice and not a necessity. You don't have to work with the concept, though you may choose to do so. One modest aim in writing the book was to make people and organisations think twice before using the term and the concept of quality, to put a stutter, to use Nicholas Rose's metaphor, in the dominant narrative. We didn't call for the concept to be abandoned, but rather for its use to be a deliberate choice, a political choice, made with an awareness that there are other ways of talking about what is important to us. So instead of going on about quality this and quality this, we could find, and we might find, other ways of talking about why a service was important to us. So quality is a choice. Think twice. Make a deliberate choice to use or not. And there are other ways of thinking about and talking about what is important to us. Okay, so that's what we wrote, and they said the book at one level was quite successful. So let me turn to the failure. Now, it's been my choice since writing the book not to use quality unless I'm doing a lecture like this one. Obviously, I have to use it. And I don't choose to use quality because I believe it reduces education to the technical, the standardised and the managerial. Yeah. It reduces what Antonio Novoa, the Portuguese educator, says. It reduces the ability to see the unknown and therefore to distance ourselves from what is already known, opening up to new possibilities of thinking. And it reduces a capacity to say what is important to us and engage in a democratic politics of education. In short, it depoliticizes education, a horrible word, I apologize for it. But mine, I acknowledge, is a minority position. Because if we look around, whether in reports from international organisations, policy documents from governments, or the publication of researchers, few people and organisations think twice before using the term. Quality continues to be taken for granted. We continue to live, as we said in the book, in the age of quality. Which leaves me pondering, when I have some time to ponder, why is it so difficult to drop the word, to get beyond quality, and why is it so hard to find other ways of talking about what is important to us? So my attempt to explain the failure of beyond quality goes something like this. Quality is an important human technology. This is Nicholas Rose again, his concept of how we develop human technologies to help us govern and shape people's behaviour and desires in ways we want them to go. It's an important human technology in what has been called new public management, the application of management methods from private business, like building cars, to reform public sectors like education. New public management's modus operandi includes setting explicit standards and then measuring performance against standards. Quality, with its will to establish conformity to norm and its belief this can be done objectively, is an example of this modus operandi. And new public management, of which quality is a symptom, is a product of the neoliberal age in which we live. It has been described, new public management, as the neoliberal way of governance. So, quality, therefore, is one of the many offspring of the neoliberal age. And this is a quote by Stephen Ball, who some of you will know. He's, I think, the preeminent scholar of neoliberalism and education. And he wrote, "Neoliberalism now configures great swathes of our daily lives and structures our experience of the world. How we understand the way the world works, how we understand ourselves and others, and how we relate to ourselves in others. We are produced by it." And those of you who will have read Stephen Ball will have read the way he describes so well how we embody neoliberalism and we become inscribed by its thinking and its values and so on. We become neoliberal subjects. And it's all very strange because if you went out on the street, probably in Auckland and in London, and stopped 100 people and said, "What do you think of neoliberalism?" 99 would look at you rather blankly and say, "Pardon? No idea what you're talking about." And yet there's no doubt, I think, that neoliberalism has been enormously influential over the last generation or so. I apologise to those of you who studied the subject, but I think I should just do a very quick nutshell version of neoliberalism. It's been described in many ways, including as a thought collective, as a political movement, as a theory of everything, a theory that explains the whole of life, and just as a successful story. And one way of understanding neoliberalism is it's a regime of economization, another one of those horrible Asian words, which can be thought of as the insertion, the introduction of economic rationality into every nook and cranny of life. Everything in life becomes pervaded by economic thinking, economic rationality. The American political scientist who writes very cogently on this, Wendy Brown, says it's the conversion of non-economic domains, activities and subjects into economic ones, to all spheres of life, right down to the most intimate. And neoliberalism would say who you choose for your partner, whether you choose to have children, and if so, how and when, is very much determined by economization. It's a process of weighing up the economics, gains and benefits. And indeed, neoliberalism values competition, individual choice. I put individual in brackets to distinguish it from the collective choice, which is perhaps a way of thinking of democracy, which is quite at odds with neoliberalism, and calculation. It values a constant process of calculating what is in our best interest. And neoliberalism has in mind an ideal subject, sometimes called Homo economicus, economic man or woman. And this subject is self-interested and competitive, independent. Independence is the idea of being autonomous from other people is very important, and it's self-reliant. A market actor, somebody who can actually duck and weave. Black Friday, I guess, is the absolute ideal day for the perfect neoliberal to be out there calculating and being a market actor. But also a flexible worker, constantly able to change their capabilities to offer what the market needs at the time the market needs it. And always calculating what is in their best interest. I think it's Foucault who talks about this ideal subject as an entrepreneur of the self. We are constantly making ourselves more perfect so we can get a better return when we offer ourselves to the labour market. Constantly we have to be perfecting our offer. Now, neoliberalism has spawned, I think, a number of associated theories. One is new public management, which I've just touched on. The second one is human capital, which today is one of the most powerful and common theories used when early childhood education is being advocated, especially to governments and international organisations. There is somebody called James Heckman, an economist, who is very, very influential around the world for his work on human capital, which the idea of human capital is it's marketable skills acquired through investment in education and training. And human capital is needed for economic success. For your economic success as an individual or an employer or a national economy, you need a large stock of human capital. You need to build up this capital. Another way of looking at it is the ultimate economization of the individual. And it's very powerful, as I say, in today's education. And the third theory, again, which is probably not widely known, but is quite influential, is public choice. The idea that public servants and public sectors are driven by self-interest. They're inherently inefficient, self-serving and untrustworthy, which will lead you down the road of privatisation and turning to the private sector for your public services. Now, the impact of neoliberalism on compulsory education has been very strong, and it's been very well documented. Stephen Ball being one example. He's written extremely powerfully, but lots of other people have done it. Neoliberalism's impact has been driven by what Pasi Sahlberg, a Finnish educator who's a professor, I think, at Melbourne University now, he has referred to the global education reform movement. If you get the acronym, which emerged in the 1980s and, as he writes, has been increasingly adopted as an educational reform orthodoxy within many education systems throughout the world. So germ has actually flowed through education in many parts of the world. And it has 5 main symptoms, according to Sahlberg: a focus on core subjects, numeracy and literacy. Did I pick that up at the weekend? I don't. Other words, a narrowing of education, back to basics. When did I heard that 20 years ago? It all seems terribly old hat. Standardization, performance standards set for pupils, schools and countries. Test-based accountability, measurement, high-stakes testing. Market logic, introducing competition, individualization and privatization. And corporate and business management models. So that has been, again in a nutshell, how neoliberalism has impacted on education systems throughout the world. And it's also had a profound effect on early childhood education, though it's received less attention than in compulsory school education or indeed in higher education. There's been a lot written about neoliberalism in the university. But there have been some exceptions. There is a splendidly outraged article by Australian researcher Margaret Sims. I recommend it to you if you want a good blast. It's excellent. Neoliberalism, she writes, has had a devastating impact on the early childhood sector with its focus on standardization, push-down curriculum, and its positioning of children as investments, human capital, for future economic productivity. And there's also a very interesting example from New Zealand. Margaret Stewart did a very interesting PhD thesis at the, get this right, University of Auckland Technology. And the title was Human Capital Theory and Early Childhood Education in New Zealand. You can get it online. One of the things she wrote is, human capital theory has influenced the direction of early childhood education policy and practice in New Zealand since the beginning of the 21st century. The value of ECE, as with education in general, is discussed in terms of cost-benefit investment returns to both the individual and the state. And then, most recently, my colleague Guy Robert Holmes from the Institute of Education and I have explored neoliberalism's entanglement with early childhood education in this book, rather prosaically titled Neoliberalism and Early Childhood Education. Particularly, we've looked at marketization and privatization and commodification. We've looked at neoliberalism's images of child educator and early childhood centres, and we've looked at how neoliberalism's governance of early childhood works, including new public management. So that's the halfway point advertisement. Right. So over time, the relationship, for me anyway, between neoliberalism, quality and early childhood has become increasingly clear. So to kind of recap, quality is a human technology of new public management. It's part of that neoliberal way of governance. We govern the centres through that language of evaluation. And it's played a major role in what I think is the dominant neoliberal story about early childhood education. And I become quite interested in the idea, which is hardly original, that we tell stories about things, including stories about education and what we think it is, what we think it should be, etc. And I've written about the idea that the neoliberal story, the very dominant story about early childhood education, is what I call the story of quality and high returns, which in another nutshell goes, apply the correct human technologies, which you could say is also known as quality, at the correct time, that is the early years, and you will have very high returns on investment. You'll get improved education, employment, earnings, more human capital, reduced social problems, and then we all live happily ever after. Now, there are many, I've collected many examples of this story from the last 15 years from many international organizations and countries. But I was coming to Australia before New Zealand, and I thought I'd just have a peep to see if there was a story from Australia. And lo and behold, from earlier this year, and again, don't expect you to kind of absorb all of this. This is from the Australian government's early years strategy, published in March, I think. And again, you very quickly get the flavour. The evidence for a return on investment in the early years is strong. Potential value of future benefits that can be realised as a result of early intervention is over $5.4 billion per annum. Australian governments are spending blah each year, which could be avoided through early intervention. Economist James Heckman has shown high quality early childhood programs for disadvantaged children can yield returns of between $4 and $16 for every dollar invested. It's a bit vague, 4 or 16. I wouldn't put my money in a bank which told me you might get $4 back or you might get 16. And it goes on, and then it ends up economic analysis conducted by PricewaterhouseCoopers, and the Front Project in 2019 identified a $2 benefit for every dollar invested. So what's quite a bit sceptical, but it goes from being 4 or 16 down to $2 benefit for that. But anyway, you get the drift of it, and there are lots and lots of these ones, which in another one of my talks, I then riff off and say that I don't believe any of it, and it's an example of magical thinking. But that's for another day. Okay, so an important feature of neoliberalism, as I've already touched on, is that it prioritises technical practice. The focus under neoliberalism is on technical questions, and a technical question is one that has one correct answer. Like my fridge won't work. Please tell me how I fix it. And in theory, I know it doesn't quite work that way often, but in theory, the engineer comes in and says, "Oh, your widget's gone, and this is what you need to do." And so, typical technical question are: what works? What's best practice? Is this quality? And as I've said, the other side of the coin is that neoliberalism depoliticizes. It emphasizes the technical, depoliticizes. There is, because its motto, its mantra, and those of you who remember Margaret Thatcher can hear these words ringing in your ears. There is no alternative, she would say, because there is only one way we can go. So there's no discussion of political questions about, for example, images, understandings, purposes, values, ethics. And what makes political questions, as opposed to technical questions, is that there is no one correct answer, but many possible and conflicting answers. And so, being a theory of everything, neoliberalism has no place or time for such indeterminate questions. So, we're faced by a dominant neoliberal regime, particularly strong in the Anglosphere. The epicenter of neoliberalism has been the United States and the United Kingdom, with countries like Australia and New Zealand not far behind. Can we therefore get beyond the gravitational pull? Can we get beyond quality? And can we make political practice, rather than technical practice, first practice where we start from? To which my answers are possibly. Firstly, because I think we are faced by converging existential crises. I don't need to tell this audience the sorts of crises we're facing, not just in the environment, but in many other respects. And I think there's a fairly wide agreement, at least in those who look at these subjects, that we simply cannot continue as we are. And possibly because the neoliberalism age has undoubtedly caused havoc, but is passing, arguably. Joseph Stiglitz, for example, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, writes, "If the 2008 financial crisis failed to make us realise that unfettered markets don't work, the climate crisis certainly should. Neoliberalism will literally bring an end to our civilization." And the German sociologist Jens Beckert, in a recent article, writes, "Neoliberalism's promises did not survive the test of the real world. Today they are largely exhausted." And there's quite a lot more in this vein. I've just finished before I came here, reading a new book by Professor Gary Goethals, who's Professor of American History at Cambridge University. And the book is entitled The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order. And it's it's writing about the fact that neoliberalism, like all isms, like all regimes, is never permanent. It moves through a cycle on there. So it's possible that we're coming to an end. To state the historically obvious, like all dominant regimes, neoliberalism is eventually replaceable. Nothing remains the same. In other words, if it was, we would never change as societies. So I think it's time to adopt Milton Friedman's advice. Those of you who don't know, Milton Friedman is the godfather, or one of the godfathers of neoliberalism, and writing in the 1960s, when neoliberalism was a fairly minor, had a fairly minor place in the world, a world dominated, might crudely call by a social democratic regime. Milton Friedman in the 1960s wrote, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So that, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." And a decade later, the politically impossible became politically inevitable, and neoliberalism began its rise to its hegemonic position. The challenge, I think, facing us today is to work on alternative ideas, policies, and stories, and make politics first practice. Making politics first practice, starting from political questions, was Loris Malaguzzi's starting point. And those of you who don't know, Loris Malaguzzi is one of the great educational thinkers and practitioners of the last century, Italian, associated with the municipal schools of Reggio Emilia, which are world famous for their early childhood education. And he wrote, "Pedagogy, education, is always a political discourse, whether we know it or not. It clearly means working with political choices." So work on alternatives in education, I think, needs to start from asking political questions. What is your image of the child, of the educator, of the early childhood centre? Indeed, I should say of the parent, I should have added. What are the purposes of education? What is it for? Why do we do it? What do we mean by education or care? What are the fundamental values and ethics of education? And from asking these questions and discussing them and debating them, alternative ideas and policies and stories then emerge, made through ideally a democratic politics of education. Now, attempts to do some of this rethinking and repoliticizing can be found in two books which offer ideas and policies for an alternative early childhood system. And I'm not claiming this at all are the only places this is happening. Alternatives are being discussed in other places. I'm just using the opportunity to do a bit of light advertising. On the far side, published in 2020, is Transforming Early Childhood in England Towards a Democratic Education, with contributions from a range of researchers at the Institute of Education. And although it says in England, quite a lot of it, I think, is of more general interest. For example, there's a very interesting chapter by Alison Clark on slow pedagogy and on democracy from Diana Souza. And then on this side, coming soon in May 2024, is Early Childhood in the Anglosphere, which looks across 7 Anglophone countries, including New Zealand, including England. Now, in this new book that Linda and I have been working on, we propose and argue for a fully integrated, universal and public system of early childhood education, funded in the same way as schools. I'm not going to talk what I mean by public, although we did have a discussion earlier, and all of these words could be developed further, but I can just float them in front of you. And in the book also gives example of France and Sweden to give contrasts. And Sweden is a very good example of a country that has this integrated universal public system of early childhood education for children from 1 to 6. We also propose and argue for a fully integrated, multi-purpose, community-based service. And we give the example of these children's centres from England, returning to Jacques Tizard's model. So these are children's centres focused on education, but then adding lots of other projects, education plus, plus, plus. And we talk about and argue for a well-qualified, well-paid early childhood teaching workforce. And we give developments from your country. And I know there are problems, but you have, I think, the highest proportion of graduate teachers working in any country in the world on there. You could always do more. I know you can, and I am very aware of the, and you're quite right to be critical, but you are ahead even of the Nordic countries in the level of qualification of your workforce. And we argue too for well-paid parenting leave in synergy with early childhood services. And again, boringly, we bring in Sweden. Sweden has 13 months of very well-paid parenting leave divided between mothers and fathers. And children of 12 months, they have an absolute entitlement to an early childhood centre provided by, in the public system. We propose and argue for a fully integrated, universal and public system of early childhood education based on children's rights, including education from birth, which of course is in General Comment number 7 of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, and gender equality. We argue for it to be based on the importance of care for all children and in all early childhood services, care understood as a relational ethic, an ethic of care, and not as a commodity to be sold to certain parents. And we argue for early childhood education as a public good and an essential part of the welfare state and what some call social infrastructure. This means, to be quite clear, no separate childcare services or childcare workers, no markets, and no for-profit provision in the public system. We're very clear on this. Okay, I go back to this idea that we also see the system inscribed with a democratic culture, and Diana and I describe a democratic culture like this. Our approach, therefore, is to treat democracy in education not just as a relationship or a method, but more broadly as a culture, an organic assemblage of norms or values, beliefs and attitudes that create meanings, purposes, practices and images, which in turn produce collective ways of being, doing and thinking. And when we talk about values, beliefs and attitudes, we have in mind, for example, values such as equality and social justice, participation and dialogue, solidarity and interdependency, uncertainty and subjectivity, difference and multiple perspectives. When we talk about beliefs, we talk about beliefs in children as citizens with rights, a belief in children as born competent with 100 languages, as worth listening to, and a belief in the importance of the public good. An attitude such as civility, conviviality, respect, and caring. And additionally, I have proposed and argued for alternative stories in early childhood education. Stories for a transformed system. For example, the story which I write about in this book, the story of democracy, experimentation and potentiality. I talked about the neoliberal story of quality and high returns. This is an attempt to show that there are other possible stories, and there are many others that could be told. And this story tells of an education built upon and inscribed with two fundamental values, democracy and experimentation, and a belief in the endless and unknowable potentialities of people and the institutions they create. And within this transformed and re-politicized early childhood education, there is the possibility of getting at last beyond quality. For as I've said, quality is just one language of evaluation, a very technical, managerial language of rating scales, etc. But early childhood education that starts from political practice and a democratic culture needs another language of evaluation, a language we call in Beyond Quality the language of meaning making. Meaning making, we write in Beyond Quality, foregrounds a deepening understanding of the pedagogical work and other projects of the institution, leading to the possibility of making a judgment of value about these projects. So if quality is a language which requires a statement of fact, a number or a category, in meaning making we return to the importance of judgments of value based on a deepening understanding of what goes on in institutions, the pedagogy there. The discourse of meaning making can be seen as reclaiming the idea of judgment, but understood now to be a discursive act always made in a relationship with others. For example, so these are judgments then that are always situated, provisional and relevant. You always have to make a judgment in relation to the particular situation, the particular place, the particular experience you're looking at. And tools for meaning making and judgments of value include pedagogical documentation, but also New Zealand's learning stories. And the question marks are there because there will be other forms of evaluative tool for this language. As Milton Friedman says, there is much to be done working on alternatives, ready for when the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable. We need, therefore, a continuing participatory and inclusive process of working on alternatives, with many involved, including teachers, playing an active role in various forums. And this role, this active role for teachers as protagonists, is commensurate with an image of teachers, as they say in Reggio Emilia, as researchers, as co-constructors of knowledge, as democratic professionals, and as Loris Malaguzzi told his teachers, as intellectuals. We need too much democratic experimentalism, including perhaps a return to the centres of innovation you used to have. I thought that was a very nice piece of work you had, and it's a pity it got ditched just as it was getting going. So let me end with this thought. That transformation is not really an option. Diana Souza and I write this. We have learned that transformation can draw knowledge, strength and passion from the past and the present, whether from innovative thinkers and practitioners or prefigurative practices and projects, providing proof of viability. Last but not least, it seems that transformation is not really an option. As Ruth Levitas reminds us, for those who think that utopia is impossible, what really is impossible is to carry on as we are. And I finish, first of all, with my email, because there may not be time to ask questions or have a discussion. So please get in touch with me if you want to discuss. I also have flyers for all these publications, all of which are free of online access. And I have a postscript. I was working with Linda Mitchell on this book. I discovered, to my amazement and pleasure, not only that we shared many values and ambitions for early childhood education, but that Jack Tizard, such an important figure in my life, was Linda's uncle. And that seems a perfect ending to my New Zealand connection. Thank you very much.